It was early July, 2021. The cold of the Yarra Valley clung to the air, frost painting the grass white, and fog settling in the hollows. The sharp, laughing call of a kookaburra cut through the morning quiet, echoing off the towering gum trees. The suburban streets of Healesville were already coming alive. Traders' utes rumbled past, their trays loaded. Parents were starting the school run, breath pluming in the air. Kids in beanies raced down driveways, laughing. Behind all this everyday activity, in the small, brick police station just off the main street, the atmosphere was business as usual. The officer at the desk was busy with paperwork, while another fielded a call about a wandering roo. But the routine shifted when a young man, his face grim, and his steps hurried, pushed through the glass doors. The man's name was Liam Turner. He was only 30, but he looked older, worn down by a deep exhaustion. His eyes were red raw, as if he hadn't slept in days. His hair was a mess, and the flannel shirt he wore was creased and dull. He stood for a moment at the front counter, then nodded respectfully to the officer on duty. His voice was hoarse when he introduced himself. He said he was there to report his wife missing. Those words made the few officers in the room look up. A missing person report was always taken seriously, especially when it involved a young woman with a small child. The officer on duty that morning was Detective Sergeant Dave Nguyen. He was a cop in his 40s, with a calm, steady face that radiated authority. His dark hair was starting to grey at the temples, but his eyes were sharp, as if they could read exactly what you were thinking. He asked Liam to take a seat on the simple plastic chair. He got a plastic cup of water from the cooler and slid it across the desk. With a trembling hand, Liam took the cup, took a small sip, then drew a long, shuddering breath, as if trying to gather his courage. Dave didn't rush him. He knew someone in distress needed a moment to find their center. Slowly, Liam began to talk. He was a FIFO worker, a supervisor on a mining project up in the Pilbara, Western Australia. The job meant he was rarely home. Sometimes he only got back to Victoria once a month, on his week off. Back home, his wife, Sarah Turner, 28, lived with their only child, a boisterous 4-year-old boy named Noah. Also living with them was his father, Gary Murdoch, a 54-year-old man, who helped look after his grandson and ran a small, cash-in-hand butchery and deli from a converted shed on their property. Their life was simple. They weren't rolling in it, but they were close. Usually, despite the distance, Liam and Sarah were always connected. They'd FaceTime almost every night. Sometimes just for a few minutes, just to hear Noah babble about his new truck or the magpie that kept stealing the dog's food. For Liam, those simple moments were enough to wash away the fatigue of a long shift. But 3 days ago, all communication had stopped. Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail. His messages wouldn't deliver. Even the family WhatsApp group, usually buzzing, had fallen silent. Liam's heart hammered. He felt something was deeply wrong. A young mother wouldn't just abandon her little boy. Liam had tried calling his dad. Gary told him that he and Sarah had argued 3 days ago, a blow-up about money. Sarah had wanted to send a few $100s to her mother in Geelong, who was struggling. But Gary had refused, claiming the butchery business was slow. The argument had gotten heated. Gary said Sarah had stormed off, packing a bag and leaving the house. But the part Liam couldn't swallow, the part that made no sense, was the fact that Sarah had left Noah behind. According to Liam, his wife would never, ever do that. Sarah was a loving, devoted mother. She was the one who always read Noah a story before bed. The one who was always up first to make his breakfast. How could she possibly be willing to leave her 4-year-old son? That night, Liam couldn't shake the anxiety. He called his supervisor and put in for emergency leave. He booked the first flight he could get from Karratha, connecting through Perth to Melbourne. The journey felt endless, though it was only a few hours. He sat in the airport terminal, his mind a whirlwind. He remembered his wife's smile. He remembered how Noah would run into his arms every time he walked through the door. His gut was filled with guilt for being so busy, for being away so much. He felt he should have been there for Sarah when the trouble started. On the plane, he stared out at the vast red desert giving way to clouds, praying silently that his wife was okay. But a sickening sense of dread hounded him. He arrived at Tullamarine in the dead of night and drove straight to their home in the valley. From the outside, the old weatherboard house looked normal. The small deli sign was still out, the porch light on. His father greeted him with a tired look. But the atmosphere felt wrong, hollow. Liam went straight to their bedroom. Sarah's clothes were still in the wardrobe. Her jewelry, small pieces he'd bought her for their anniversary, was still on the dresser. Her wallet and driver's license were in the drawer. All of it made him more certain his father's story was bullshit. A woman who was truly planning on leaving wouldn't just abandon all her valuables like that. Liam's heart grew heavier. His eyes burned. He felt something was being hidden from him. So that morning, he'd forced himself to come to the station. In front of Detective Sergeant Nguyen, he recounted every detail. His voice trembled. He had to stop several times to keep from breaking down. Dave listened without interjecting, just nodding occasionally. He knew this case couldn't be taken lightly. A young mother had vanished. A small child was left behind. A husband was frantic. And a father-in-law was telling a story that didn't add up. It was all like pieces of a puzzle that needed to be assembled carefully. Dave decided the first step was to go to the house himself. As he made the decision, the morning sun cut through the station's blinds. Dust motes danced in the light, silent witnesses to the start of a long journey. A journey to find the truth, to uncover the mystery hidden inside a simple house on the edge of the Yarra Valley. No one knew what had really happened to Sarah Turner. But one thing was certain, Liam's report was the opening line of a dark story, one that would eventually shake the small community to its core. For Liam, his last hope now rested with the police. For Dave, this wasn't just another missing person file. This might be the start of a major case that needed to be solved, and fast. The sun was higher in the sky when Detective Sergeant Nguyen, along with two uniformed officers, headed for Liam's house. Their police sedan moved slowly through the streets, passing rows of houses with neat gardens, towering eucalyptus trees, and rolling green paddocks in the distance. The route was lined with small local shops, kids on bikes, and farmers heading back from the feed store. The scenery was peaceful, but Liam, sitting in the back seat, felt anything but. He was on edge. His thumb wouldn't stop swiping across his phone's dark screen, even though he knew there would be no message from his wife. Liam's family home was on a larger block on the western edge of town. It wasn't a big place, just a simple weatherboard house, its white paint starting to fade. At the front was the converted shed that served as the small deli, a glass display counter inside showing cured meats and sausages. Beside it was a solid steel table for processing. The middle of the house was the living room, and at the back were the bedrooms, a bathroom, and a small yard with a chook pen and a rundown shed. They were far from wealthy. But this place was where they made their living. When they arrived, they saw Gary Murdoch scattering feed for his chickens. He was a broad-shouldered man, his skin weathered from the sun. He looked tired but tried to muster a friendly smile. When he saw his son get out of the police car, he froze for a second. The smile he attempted looked forced and stiff. With a gravelly voice, he invited them inside. He said he was worried sick about Sarah, his daughter-in-law. He repeated the same story he'd told Liam on the phone, the argument about the money, Sarah getting angry and leaving with a bag. Dave Nguyen listened calmly, but his eyes never left Gary, watching his every movement. The way he spoke, the way his gaze sometimes darted away, Dave felt he was hiding something. As an experienced investigator, he knew that when someone repeated a story with the exact same details, too perfectly, it was often a sign it had been rehearsed. Dave didn't accuse him. He just asked for permission to look at Sarah's room. They entered the small bedroom in the middle of the house. It was simple. A wardrobe, a dresser, a bed with a floral doona cover. The wardrobe door was ajar. Some clothes were clearly missing, but on the dresser, her small gold bracelet and wedding earrings were still there. Sarah's wallet was in a drawer, complete with her ID and some loose change. Dave frowned. Why would someone leaving over money leave behind jewelry and all her ID? He logged it all in his mind. Liam, who had followed them in, just stared blankly. To him, these items were concrete proof that his wife hadn't just left. He picked up one of the earrings from its small box. His heart ached. He remembered their wedding day, when he had nervously fastened that same earring onto her ear. Noah, their son, was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, his face a mask of confusion and fear. The boy looked at the officers. Dave approached him, crouching down and speaking softly. He asked, "Have you played with Mummy in the last few days, mate?" The little boy shook his head. Then, in a tiny voice, he said, "Mummy's sleeping." The words hung in the air, silencing the room. Liam stared at his son, his eyes wide. Dave's mind raced. It could just be the innocent words of a child, but it could also be a clue. After leaving the room, Dave stood on the front porch. He scanned the area. The neighbor's house wasn't far, just across the quiet street. He asked Liam if any of the neighbors had security cameras. Liam pointed to the house opposite, a larger, two-story brick home belonging to a local businessman. According to Liam, the owner had just installed a full CCTV system a few months back. One of the cameras was pointed directly at the street, covering the front of their house. Hearing that, Dave felt a surge of hope. If Sarah had really left the house 3 days ago, the footage would show it. But if it didn't, Gary's story would fall apart. Gary, standing not far from them, looked visibly agitated. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but a thin sheen of sweat was gathering on his forehead. Dave glanced at him, then immediately led his team toward the neighbor's house to check. In his gut, Dave was now sure this case was not simple. His instincts were telling him there was a dark secret hidden behind Sarah Turner's disappearance. Meanwhile, Liam stood staring at his own front yard. He remembered Sarah hanging out the washing, humming to herself. He remembered Noah running to greet her when she came back from the shops. He remembered them sitting on the porch together, drinking tea in the afternoon. All those memories now felt hollow. He felt his warm home had turned cold without his wife. He was filled with a desperate prayer for the truth, no matter what it was. He just needed to know where his wife was. For him, certainty was far better than this torturing limbo. On the other side of the street, Dave Nguyen was already forming a plan. Every step had to be precise. He knew if foul play was involved, time was critical for finding evidence. The first step was to check that neighbor's camera footage. From there, the direction of the investigation would become much clearer. Dave looked up at the sky, which was becoming overcast. The wind carried the smell of someone's wood-burning heater. The town felt normal, as if nothing had happened. But beneath that calm, a mystery was waiting to be uncovered. That afternoon, the neighbor's house was welcoming. The owner, a man in his 60s everyone knew as Barry Henderson, was friendly when Dave and his team, along with Liam, knocked. His house was much larger than Liam's. Solid brick, and at the top, several security cameras were visible. Barry owned the local Mitre 10 hardware store, and was fairly successful. He was happy to help, and when the police explained, he didn't hesitate. With a polite smile, he led them into his comfortable, air-conditioned study. Dave explained why they were there. He said the camera footage could be crucial in confirming whether Sarah had left the house 3 days ago. Barry nodded with understanding. He said his system recorded 24/7, and the data was stored for a week. Hearing that, Dave felt a wave of relief. This meant there was a very good chance of finding a solid lead. A technical officer was called in to bring the specialized equipment. They sat in front of a monitor connected to the hard drive. The footage from 3 days ago began to play. All eyes were fixed on the screen. At first, it was just normal street activity. People walking their dogs. Kids riding bikes past. A delivery van. Occasionally, Gary could be seen, coming out to feed the chooks or sitting on his front porch. Then, they saw Sarah. She was sweeping the front driveway, with Noah running around her feet. Liam's breath caught in his throat, seeing his wife so clearly on the screen. It was so real, as if she was still right there. But as the day's recording rolled on, Sarah's figure was gone. She and Noah had gone inside. There was no footage of her coming out with a bag. No one walking down the driveway. No car leaving. Right through until evening. The only person seen was Gary, coming and going a few times. The footage rolled over to the next day. Still no sign of Sarah leaving. Everyone in the room held their breath. This fact was a direct contradiction of Gary's story. Dave stared at the screen, his expression serious. He looked at Liam. Liam's eyes were glistening. He was now more certain than ever that something terrible had happened to his wife inside that house. Gary, who had been invited over to watch the footage, tried to look calm, but his face was pale. He stammered that maybe Sarah had left via the back paddock, or that the camera had malfunctioned. But the excuses sounded weak. Dave didn't respond directly. He just asked the technical officer to copy the entire 3-day recording to take back to the station as evidence. For Dave, this footage was the turning point. He realized this was no longer a missing person case, it was a potential serious criminal investigation. After leaving Barry's house, Dave spoke to Liam outside. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder and told him to stay strong. Liam nodded, his face a mask of grief. A million questions swirled in his head. Why had his father lied? Why hadn't Sarah been seen leaving? And what really happened inside their home? That night, Liam couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, staring blankly at the table where he and his wife used to eat together. Noah was asleep in his lap. The little boy had no idea that his mother might never be coming back. Meanwhile, at the Healesville police station, Dave Nguyen wrote up a detailed report. He noted that the CCTV footage proved Sarah had never left the house. He also noted Gary's suspicious statement. He knew the next step was a full-scale, forensic search of the house. But for that, he'd need a warrant. That night, Dave called his superior, Detective Chief Inspector Kate Wilson, to explain the critical findings. DCI Wilson, hearing the report, immediately gave the go-ahead to proceed. She said the case had to be handled quickly, every minute could mean the loss of vital evidence. The next day, the atmosphere at Liam's house grew even more tense. Neighbors started asking questions, wondering why police cars kept coming and going. Whispers started. Some said Sarah had run off. Others suspected something far worse. The usual warm, neighborly vibe was replaced with a sense of unease. Still, many neighbors supported Liam. They dropped off meals, asked after Noah, and offered to help. Amidst his turmoil, their support helped Liam feel a little less alone. Gary continued to try and act normally. He sat on the front porch, smoking a cigarette and watching the street. But his eyes were different. He would occasionally glance at Liam, then quickly look away. Detective Sergeant Nguyen, who returned that afternoon, noticed the subtle shifts in Gary's body language. Dave was certain the older man was hiding something huge. But he didn't want to be hasty. He knew that to uncover the truth, he needed hard evidence. And that evidence was likely still hidden inside the house that now felt so menacing. That night, the atmosphere in Liam's home felt heavy. A cool breeze blew in from the paddocks behind the house, carrying the scent of damp earth. Inside, Noah slept soundly beside his grandfather. Liam sat, lost in thought, in the living room. The dim, yellow light of a single bulb lit his grim face. He stared at a framed wedding photo on the wall. Sarah's face in the photo was bright, smiling in a white dress, while he stood beside her, his expression full of hope. Liam let out a long sigh. His chest felt tight. The image of his wife haunted him, as if she was calling to him from somewhere far away. Ever since the CCTV footage showed Sarah had never left, Liam's mind had been in chaos. He replayed the last 3 days over and over. He'd spoken to her on the phone, she'd sounded happy, if a little tired. Then, suddenly, nothing. The phone dead, messages unread, and only this unbelievable story from his father. He felt a crushing guilt for leaving his family for so long. If only he'd been home, maybe none of this would have happened. The regret pressed down on him like a physical weight. Detective Sergeant Nguyen, who stopped by again that evening, found Liam still awake. He sat in the wooden chair opposite Liam, trying to offer some reassurance. He said that the investigation couldn't rely on gut feelings alone, it had to be built on solid proof. Dave stressed the importance of patience. He told Liam to stay strong for Noah. The words calmed Liam slightly. They didn't erase his anxiety, but in the silence, he held his sleeping son close, vowing to do whatever it took to find out the truth about his wife. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Liam decided to walk to the local bakery. He wanted to ask around, to see if anyone had seen Sarah. The bakery was already busy. The smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air. A few of the shop owners knew Liam, and immediately asked for news. They were surprised they hadn't seen Sarah doing her usual shopping for the past few days. One of the women at the fruit shop even said Sarah had promised to come in 3 days ago to pick up an order, but she never showed. All of this just confirmed to Liam that his wife had never gone far. When he returned home, he saw his father sitting on the porch, smoking. Gary stared blankly at the street. His face was rigid. Liam wanted to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat. There was a mix of anger and bewilderment. He couldn't understand how his own father could seem so calm while his daughter-in-law was missing. The suspicion grew stronger. But he chose to stay silent. He knew the police were working, and a direct confrontation would only make things worse. He prayed that Dave Nguyen would find a breakthrough soon. Meanwhile, Detective Sergeant Nguyen was back at his office, holding a briefing with his team. They discussed the next steps. Everyone agreed the case was now highly suspicious. The CCTV footage, Gary's contradictory statement, and the state of Sarah's room, all of it pointed away from her leaving voluntarily. Dave proposed they apply for a formal search warrant. He was convinced that was the only way they would find the answers. The following days dragged on, thick with tension. Liam stayed home, waiting for news from the police. Noah kept asking for his mum. His innocent questions were like a knife in Liam's heart. He could only answer that Mummy was away for a little while, even though he didn't believe it himself. The nights were sleepless. The days were filled with anxiety. The neighbors' whispers grew louder. Some showed sympathy. Others just spread rumors. Liam didn't care. All he wanted was an answer about Sarah. Gary continued to act as normally as he could. He fed the chooks, prepared some meat in the deli, and spoke curtly to the neighbors. But his eyes were always dark. Sometimes, he'd be seen staring into space for a long time in the backyard, as if deep in heavy thought. For Liam, this behavior only amplified the suspicion. But he kept it to himself. He knew, sooner or later, the truth would come out, and he had to be ready for whatever it was. In the background, Dave Nguyen kept working. He filed the detailed report, collected all the evidence, and submitted the application for a search warrant to the magistrate. He knew this step was serious, but without it, the case would stall. Every second mattered, and he wouldn't let the trail go cold. Late at night, before heading home, he paused. He thought of Sarah's face, a young mother who might have been the victim of something terrible. He was determined not to stop until he found the truth. On the fourth day since Sarah was reported missing, the town was rife with speculation. Some people were gossiping, but many were also holding prayer groups at the local church, hoping for Sarah's safe return. The sense of community spirit and compassion meant that people wanted to help however they could. Liam felt a small comfort from the support, even as his heart was breaking. Finally, good news came from the station. The search warrant had been approved. Detective Sergeant Nguyen immediately prepared his team. Gary's house was going to be searched, top to bottom. Every inch would be examined. Liam heard the news with a mix of relief and terror. He knew this was the moment the truth would start to surface. But he was also terrified of what that truth might be. In his heart, he whispered a prayer. Please, let Sarah still be alive. Please, let this all be a horrible misunderstanding. But another part of him knew this journey was about to lead them to a grim reality. The morning air in the Yarra Valley was still when a police car pulled up in front of Liam's house, followed by a forensics van. Several officers in uniform got out, their faces serious. Detective Sergeant Nguyen held the official warrant. Liam, standing on the porch, greeted them with a pounding heart. Gary came out the front door. His face went pale when he saw the number of officers. Though he tried to smile, the hand holding his cigarette was shaking. He couldn't refuse. The warrant was read aloud, signaling the start of a full-scale forensic search of the simple weatherboard house. Officers moved into every room, meticulously. They opened wardrobes, checked drawers, examined the floors. In Sarah's room, they photographed every detail. The jewelry left behind, the wallet with her ID, the tidy clothes, all became crucial evidence. Dave Nguyen noted it all. For him, this solidified the theory that Sarah had never intended to leave. Meanwhile, Liam stood to the side, his face etched with pain. He watched as every corner of his home was treated like a crime scene. After the bedrooms, the team moved to the kitchen. The smell of cured meats and spices still hung in the air. In the corner of the attached deli area stood the large, industrial meat mincer used for the butchery. Officers looked at the machine carefully. Dave requested that it not be touched until the forensic team could examine it in detail. His gut told him something was wrong with that machine. But he didn't jump to conclusions. He knew he had to wait for the scientific analysis. Gary, sitting on a chair in the living room, looked increasingly agitated. He tried to talk, tried to convince everyone that his daughter-in-law had just left in a huff. But his words sounded empty, his gaze avoidant. Sweat ran down his temples. Dave didn't reply. He just continued to watch him with sharp eyes. Every twitch from Gary seemed to signal a heavy burden he was hiding. But until hard evidence was found, Dave held back any accusations. In the backyard, officers checked the chook pen and shed. There was a large drum of feed. It all looked normal. However, one officer found a strange stain near the floor drain in the laundry. It looked like someone had tried to scrub it away, repeatedly. When examined closely, a faint, discolored patch remained. The forensic team was called in to test if the stain was blood. Liam, seeing this, could no longer hold back his emotions. Tears streamed down his face. He tried to be strong, but his body was shaking. He turned away, not wanting Noah, who was being looked after by a neighbor, to see him so broken. The search lasted for hours. Every room was documented, every item of interest examined. The meat mincer became a special focus. The forensic team took small samples from the machine's crevices. They also used luminol in the laundry to detect the presence of blood that had been washed away. The initial test showed a positive chemical reaction. It meant there had almost certainly been blood in that room. Detective Sergeant Nguyen felt a chill run down his spine. This case was rapidly escalating into a grim reality. Meanwhile, neighbors had begun to gather at the edge of the property. They whispered among themselves, watching the police come and go. Some were curious, some showed deep sympathy. A few of the local mothers approached Liam, patting his shoulder, offering words of comfort. They told him whatever happened, he had to be strong for his son. Their support gave Liam a small anchor, even as his world was falling apart. He didn't feel completely alone, even if the truth waiting for him was unbearable. As evening approached, the search was paused. All the samples and items seized were bagged and taken to the lab for further testing. Dave gathered his team in the living room. He said the findings from that day were significant. There were multiple signs pointing to the fact that Sarah had never left the house. He also stressed that the investigation must remain professional, without rushing to judgment. They had to wait for the scientific results before making any legal moves. Gary was asked to come to the station for further questioning. His face was ashen, his steps heavy. He couldn't refuse. Liam just watched from a distance. His mind was racing. He felt the truth was close, but he was terrified of what it would be. On the drive to the station, Gary sat silently in the back of the police car. His gaze was empty. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap. Not a single word came out of his mouth. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of the car's engine. That night, after all the officers had left, Liam sat alone in the living room. The house was deathly quiet, save for the sound of crickets outside. He looked at his family photo again. This time, with a different feeling. There was a small hope that the truth would soon be exposed. But there was also a great fear that this truth would destroy everything. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and prayed. He told himself that whatever happened, he would accept it, as long as this mystery didn't torture him any longer. At the Healesville police station that night, the atmosphere in the interview room was tense. A bright fluorescent light buzzed overhead, illuminating the simple room. A desk, a few chairs, and a thermos of cold black coffee. Gary sat in a steel chair, his hands fidgeting. He was trying to look calm. Opposite him sat Detective Sergeant Dave Nguyen, his gaze unflinching. 2 other officers were present, one taking notes. The air was heavy, waiting for the older man to crack. Dave started with simple questions about Gary's relationship with his daughter-in-law. Gary answered in a flat tone, saying it was normal. Sometimes they disagreed, but never anything serious. He again repeated the story about the argument 3 days ago, about Sarah wanting to send money, his refusal, and her leaving with a bag. The answer was identical to the one he'd given before. To Dave, this robotic repetition only deepened the suspicion. Dave then asked for more detail. What clothes did Sarah take? What time did she leave? Did anyone see her? Gary paused for a few seconds before answering. He said she took a black duffel bag and left around dusk. But when asked who saw her, he couldn't name anyone. He just said he was the only one who saw her go. The answer only added to the suspicion. Especially since Dave was holding the CCTV footage that proved no one had left the house that day. Liam, sitting in a separate room, watched the interrogation through a one-way mirror. His blood boiled hearing his father's answers. He wanted to scream, to accuse him, but he knew it had to follow the legal process. Noah was temporarily with a neighbor, which gave him some relief. He sat anxiously, staring at the screen, praying for the truth to come out. Tears fell again. Not just for his missing wife, but for the unbelievable fact that his own father could be hiding something so monstrous. Dave recognized that Gary was good at resisting pressure. He rarely made eye contact, looking down at the table or at the wall. He answered every question briefly. No emotion, no obvious agitation, though his hands trembled slightly. Dave knew that without hard evidence, it would be difficult to get this man to confess. He decided not to push too hard. The interrogation was paused. Gary was moved to a temporary holding cell to await further questioning. Meanwhile, the forensic team at the lab was working hard on the samples from Liam's house. They examined the stain from the laundry, the samples from the meat mincer, and other small traces found in the kitchen. Each sample was coded, every step recorded. The process took time, but Dave was sure the results would provide the necessary breakthrough. He called the lab every few hours, ensuring it was being fast-tracked. He was on edge, but he kept a calm facade for his team. He knew they needed a strong leader. The next morning, the atmosphere at Liam's house was still grim. Neighbors came and went, asking for updates. Some brought food. Some offered to watch Noah. But the gossip was also spreading. Some said Sarah had run off with another man. Others suspected the worst. Liam tried to ignore it. He just wanted to focus on the investigation. He sat in the living room, holding one of Noah's small toys. He was consumed by a longing for his wife. At the station, Dave called Gary in for a second interrogation. This time, he brought photos from the search. He laid out pictures of the meat mincer and the faint stains in the laundry. He placed them on the table and asked Gary to explain. Gary's face tensed. His eyes darted between the photos. He tried to claim the stain was just regular grime, and that the mincer was, of course, used for processing meat, so it was normal for it to have traces. The answer sounded plausible to a layperson. But to an investigator, it only strengthened the suspicion. Dave leaned forward, looking Gary straight in the eye. He said that all lies eventually come to light, and that modern technology could reveal even the smallest truth. The words made Gary fall silent for a moment. But he quickly regained his cold composure, as if certain nothing could be proven. The interrogation continued for hours, but there was no confession. Gary stuck to his story. Dave closed his notepad, his face serious. He knew the real fight had just begun. That night, after the process was over, Dave left the station with heavy steps. He looked up at the dark sky. Stars were faint pinpricks over the valley. He thought to himself that this case would be one of the most difficult of his career. He wasn't just dealing with a missing woman, but with a complex web of lies built by a man who should have been a protector. But he promised himself, promised Liam, and promised Noah, that he would find the answer, no matter how dark the truth was. On the third day since the report, the police station was buzzing. The forensic team finally had preliminary news. Detective Sergeant Nguyen was called to the lab to see the initial results from the samples taken at Gary's house. In the sterile room, the experts explained calmly that the luminol tests in the laundry were definitively positive for blood that had been deliberately cleaned up. Furthermore, the industrial meat mincer also contained tiny, suspicious traces. Although more testing was needed, this was a significant development. Hearing the report, Dave felt he was getting closer to the truth. Meanwhile, at his house, Liam was struggling through the day. He tried to comfort Noah, who wouldn't stop asking for his mum. The little boy sat on the floor with his toy cars, occasionally looking at his dad with those innocent eyes. Liam could only offer a sad smile, repeating that Mummy was away for a bit. But inside, he was shattered. Every corner of the house reminded him of Sarah. The kitchen, usually alive with the sound of cooking, the bedroom, which always smelled faintly of her perfume, the front porch, where they used to sit in the evenings. It all felt empty. The details of the forensic findings hadn't been shared with Liam yet. Dave chose to wait for the complete results before saying anything. But he visited Liam that afternoon to offer a small update. He said the investigation was uncovering important things, and that the truth was getting closer. Liam just nodded, his face grim. He hugged Noah tightly, as if to shield the boy from the awful possibilities. The neighbors who saw the police visit were now convinced something serious had happened. They whispered on their porches. Some were scared. Others prayed. At the station, Gary was called in for questioning again. This time, his face looked more haggard. Dark circles hung under his eyes, his hair was unkempt. But he still tried to maintain his old story. Sarah had left after a fight. Dave listened patiently, then showed him the preliminary forensic photos. He explained that bloodstains had been confirmed in the laundry, and that the mincer was not entirely clean. Gary seemed to falter for a moment, but quickly recovered, arguing that the stains must have come from an animal he'd butchered. The answer was logical on the surface, but it weakened his position, creating more contradictions. Liam, waiting outside the interview room, heard the update from another officer. His body trembled, his heart felt like it was being ripped apart. He couldn't hold back the tears. His fears were being confirmed, his wife had never left the house. But accepting the possibility that something horrific had happened was a far greater pain. He remembered the last phone call with Sarah, her soft voice, her little laugh, her simple message to stay safe at work. All those memories now felt like a final goodbye. More neighbors came by that evening. A few of the local women organized a prayer meeting at the church, praying for Sarah's safety. The town was gripped by a collective sorrow. Parents told their children not to play near Liam's house, afraid of what had happened there. But behind the fear, the community's solidarity remained. They brought food, offered to babysit Noah, and sat with Liam, who often sat alone late into the night. The sense of community, a hallmark of the small town, was strong, even in the shadow of this mystery. Dave Nguyen continued to monitor the lab results. He knew scientific proof was his main weapon to break the lies. Every day, he received updates. He wrote everything down meticulously in his notebook. His eyes were tired, but his resolve was firm. He felt this case was not just his job as a cop, but his duty as a human being to find justice for a young mother who was, in all likelihood, gone. In his heart, he promised he wouldn't stop until it was all uncovered. Gary was backed into a corner. His face was no longer defiant. He looked down more often during questioning. His answers became shorter. Dave, an experienced interrogator, saw the signs. He knew the older man's defenses were crumbling. But he remained patient, waiting for the final results. He wouldn't make an accusation without irrefutable proof. He was waiting for the right moment, when the scientific evidence was complete and undeniable. He was sure, at that point, Gary would no longer be able to hide behind his false story. It was late when Dave drove home from the station. He passed the quiet streets. The only sounds were the crickets and the occasional barking dog. The night air was cold. He looked up at the dark sky, thinking of Sarah's face, her body still not found. In his mind, one question repeated: if Sarah Turner never left that house, where was she now? The question echoed in his head, keeping him awake. But he knew the answer was coming soon. The evidence was beginning to speak. On the 5th day since Sarah's disappearance, the atmosphere at Liam's house was still thick with grief. Noah sat on the living room floor, playing with wooden blocks. The boy seemed calm, smiling occasionally. But his innocent words made everyone who heard them shudder. When a neighbor asked where his mummy was, Noah replied quietly, "Mummy's sleeping." Those simple words made Liam's skin crawl. He knew his son didn't fully understand, but the words felt like a signal, a clue to a terrifying truth. Detective Sergeant Nguyen, who happened to be at the house at that moment, tried to dig deeper. He crouched in front of Noah, looking into the boy's innocent eyes. In a soft voice, he asked if his mummy had taken him anywhere. Noah shook his head. He just repeated that his mummy was sleeping in the house. Dave paused. He knew a child's statement couldn't be used as primary evidence. But often, a child's honesty held clues that adults missed. Noah's words only strengthened his conviction that Sarah had never left. Liam, hearing this, felt a sharp pain in his chest. Tears streamed down his face. He grabbed his son and held him tight, as if to protect him from the grim reality. That afternoon, Dave sat on the porch of Liam's house, thinking about the next steps. He looked out at the quiet yard. A large gum tree swayed in the wind. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of traffic. His mind kept returning to the same question: if Sarah really didn't leave the house, where is she? Is there any hope she's alive, or has something far more horrific happened? This thought solidified Dave's resolve. The next search had to be even more thorough. Gary, who had been quiet all morning, sat on a chair at the front of the house. He looked exhausted, his gaze empty. He didn't say much. He just lit cigarette after cigarette, exhaling with heavy sighs. Dave watched him from a distance, noticing Gary's hands were shaking. His behavior showed the immense pressure he was under. But Gary still clung to his story. He didn't know that, piece by piece, his lies were being dismantled by the evidence. The neighbors were talking about the case constantly. At the local pub, men discussed it over beers. Some believed Sarah had run off. Others were convinced she'd met a terrible fate. The whispers spread quickly through the small town. But most of the town's sympathy was with Liam. They knew how hard he worked, away from his family. They couldn't believe Sarah would just abandon her son. That moral support helped Liam stay standing, even as his heart was shattered. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, staring into the darkness. Noah was asleep in his room. Andy lit a small lamp and looked at the family photo on the wall. He remembered Noah's 3rd birthday. Sarah had baked a simple cake with small candles. The three of them had sung together, laughed together. The memory was so vivid it made his chest tighten. He felt the loss deepening, becoming more real. He prayed for the truth to come out, no matter what it was. At the station, Dave wrote a new report, incorporating Noah's statement and the initial forensic findings. He wrote carefully, adding every small detail. He knew this would be a critical part of the legal case. He also planned to interview other witnesses, including neighbors who might have heard or seen something on the night Sarah disappeared. A few neighbors did admit to hearing something strange. One woman said she'd heard a faint shout from the direction of Gary's house that night. But she wasn't sure, as the sounds of wildlife and local farm animals were common. The testimony was recorded. Though not strong, it added to the growing suspicion. Slowly, the puzzle pieces were coming together. The final picture was still blurry, but it was taking shape. Gary himself was under increasing pressure. He felt the eyes of the town on him. People who used to be friendly now looked at him with suspicion. He spent most of his time alone in the backyard, smoking endlessly. He knew his time was running out. But he remained silent. He believed that without concrete proof, the police couldn't pin anything on him. He didn't realize that scientific evidence was being meticulously gathered, and that the wall of lies he'd built was about to collapse. The night grew later. At Liam's house, only the sound of crickets could be heard. Liam sat, staring into the void. He felt choked by the uncertainty. But behind the fear, there was a small spark of hope that the truth was near. He knew Detective Sergeant Nguyen wouldn't give up. He knew that, sooner or later, Sarah's fate would be known. The next morning, the Healesville police station was a hive of activity. Officers were returning from witness interviews. The tech team was preparing the final report on the CCTV footage. Detective Sergeant Nguyen sat in the briefing room, his face serious. On the table in front of him were files, photos from the search, and a laptop showing the clips from Barry Henderson's camera. The whole team was there. That day, they had to confirm, one last time, that Sarah had never left the house. The footage was played slowly. The timestamp was clear in the corner. They saw Sarah sweeping the driveway. Noah running around. Then, both went inside. After that, nothing. The camera kept recording into the night. It only showed Gary, coming out a few times to go to the shed, take out the bins, and then go back inside. The next day was the same. Sarah's face never reappeared. Everyone in the room was silent. That fact was strong enough to confirm Gary was lying. Dave stared at the screen for a long time, then closed his eyes for a moment. He felt a cold dread. He knew where this case was heading. Gary had lied. He wasn't just a witness, he was a suspect. But Dave didn't want to be reckless. Everything had to be based on irrefutable proof. He instructed the team to secure the footage, attach it to the official report, and prepare it for the prosecution. For him, this footage was the pillar that would bring down Gary's lies. Liam, waiting anxiously outside the briefing room, stood up when Dave came out. His face was full of questions. Dave put a hand on his shoulder and told him the footage had been re-verified. The result was the same: Sarah was never seen leaving the house. Hearing this, Liam's knees buckled. He collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, tears streaming. He had suspected it, but hearing the official confirmation from the police made it terrifyingly real. He felt the loss more deeply than ever. Noah, playing in his lap, just looked up, not understanding. In the town, the news began to spread. Although the police didn't make a public announcement, the whispers moved fast. People were shocked, horrified. They began to look at Gary's house with suspicion and fear. Some whispered that a dark secret was hidden inside. Some were even afraid to walk past it at night. But behind the whispers, prayers continued, hopes for the truth to be revealed. The locals knew this was no longer just about a missing woman, it was about the safety and soul of their entire town. Gary, still in custody for questioning, found it harder to maintain his story. In his cell, he sat, staring blankly. His face looked older, his eyes sunken. He knew things were turning against him. But he stuck to his story. He believed that as long as they didn't find Sarah's body, he could still get out of this. But deep down, fear was growing. He knew the police were getting closer. Dave Nguyen didn't want to waste any time. He held a special meeting with his superior, DCI Kate Wilson. In the closed-door meeting, he laid out all the evidence, the CCTV footage, Liam's testimony, Noah's innocent words, the bloodstains in the laundry, and the preliminary lab results. DCI Wilson listened intently, then nodded. She agreed that the case status had to be upgraded immediately. This was no longer a missing person case, it was a suspected homicide. She signed the official documents, giving Dave full authority to proceed to the next stage of the investigation. Liam received the news with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was relieved the police were taking his wife's case so seriously. On the other, he was terrified of the grim reality that was fast approaching. He walked home with heavy steps, carrying Noah. The boy giggled, unaware of the heavy burden his father was carrying. Liam looked at his son's face. He promised himself he would keep fighting. For Noah, and for Sarah. That night, the town was quiet again. The sound of crickets and the rustling wind created a tense backdrop. In Liam's house, a small lamp stayed on. He couldn't sleep, just stared at the family photo. In his mind, Sarah's smile was still clear. But behind that smile, he felt as if there was a trapped scream. A scream waiting to be heard, a scream that could only be freed by the truth. Liam closed his eyes, praying for the strength to face the coming days. He knew the search for the truth was far from over, but a major step had been taken. On the 5th day since Sarah's disappearance, the Healesville police station was more intense than ever. Dave gathered his team in the small briefing room. He laid out the latest findings from the CCTV and the initial lab reports. All the evidence pointed to one shocking conclusion: Sarah Turner never left that house, and Gary Murdoch knew far more than he was saying. The room was silent, save for the whir of an old fan. Everyone realized this case had taken a very dark turn. Dave then explained the next steps. He said the investigation was now officially a homicide inquiry. All legal procedures had to be followed to the letter, leaving no loopholes. He stressed that their main goal was to find out what really happened to Sarah. The team nodded, their faces grim. They knew the road ahead would be tough, but there was no other choice. The truth, however painful, had to be uncovered. Meanwhile, at Liam's house, the mood was somber. Noah kept asking for his mum. The little boy would stand by the front door, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Liam tried to comfort him with gentle words, saying his mum was away for a bit. But inside, he was breaking. He knew Noah missed Sarah. Just like he did. The nights were agonizingly long without her. Liam often sat alone, staring into space, consumed by guilt for not being there when it all happened. News of the upgraded case status began to filter through the town. The locals were now certain something terrible had occurred. Whispers at the pub, the bakery, and even the church grew louder. Some were scared, others were filled with sympathy for Liam. They held prayer vigils for Sarah. They supported the police, urging them to find the truth. The town's usual warmth was now clouded by suspicion and anxiety. Gary, still in custody, found it increasingly difficult to maintain his composure. In the interview room, his face was gaunt. His eyes were red, his voice heavy. But he stuck to his story. Sarah had left after a fight. Dave listened, his expression unreadable. Then he showed him the evidence again, the photos of the bloodstains, the CCTV footage, the preliminary forensic report from the meat mincer. Gary fell silent for a long time. He tried to brush it off, claiming it was all a coincidence. But his voice lacked its previous conviction. Liam, waiting outside, felt a mix of anger and profound sadness. He couldn't believe his own father could be involved in his wife's disappearance. His heart was shattered, but he knew that only the truth would bring this nightmare to an end. He prayed the police would find the final piece of evidence. He didn't care how painful the reality was. All he needed was an answer. For him, the not knowing was far worse than the loss itself. Dave knew Gary was on the verge of breaking. He decided to hold off on further questioning until the final, complete lab results came back. He knew scientific proof was undeniable. In the meantime, he planned his next move, another, more extensive search of the property. This time, they would be even more thorough. Every inch of the house would be examined, every piece of equipment taken apart. He was convinced that the simple weatherboard house held a dark secret. Gary may have been meticulous in covering his tracks, but the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. That night, Dave drove home, his shoulders heavy. He passed the quiet streets. The dim streetlights illuminated the vast, dark paddocks. The sound of crickets and the night breeze accompanied his thoughts. He thought of Sarah, still missing. He thought of Noah, with his innocent eyes. It all strengthened his resolve. He vowed he wouldn't rest until the case was closed. He knew this wasn't just a job, it was a duty to bring justice. At home, Liam sat with a few neighbors who had brought over a casserole. They tried to distract him, telling stories about when Liam was a kid, how he used to be a terror on his bike. The stories brought a fleeting, sad smile to his face. Their support made him feel less isolated. He knew people cared. But still, the image of his missing wife made it impossible to sleep. He would close his eyes, only to see Sarah's face, smiling, then fading away. He would wake up, his chest tight with anxiety. The next day, the police prepared for their next big move. Dave Nguyen led the team himself. He knew the time was coming to finally lift the veil. All the evidence pointed to one place. Gary's house wasn't just a home, it was a crime scene. Dave took a deep breath, watching the sun rise over the eastern hills. He prayed, just for a moment, that everything would go smoothly. That day could be the beginning of the end of this mystery, even if the truth it revealed would shake many to their core. That morning, the air in the Yarra Valley was damp after a night of rain. The streets were still wet. The smell of damp earth was strong. A police car, followed by a forensics van, pulled up again at Liam's house. Neighbors started to gather, standing on the edge of the street, whispering. They knew today's search was serious. Detective Sergeant Nguyen was holding the new, more detailed warrant. His face was set, his steps purposeful. He knew today could be the day. Gary had been detained at the station, a strategic move to ensure he couldn't interfere with the search. The forensic team, dressed in full protective gear, emerged from the van. They carried chemical kits, detection tools, and documentation cameras. Liam stood on the porch, his face pale. A neighbor was holding Noah, keeping him away from the scene. Liam's heart was pounding. He was terrified, but also desperate for answers. He needed to know what had happened to his wife. The search began in the laundry. The walls and floor, which looked clean, were sprayed with luminol. As soon as the UV lights were turned on, faint blue-green patches glowed eerily. The team meticulously documented it, taking samples and photos of every angle. Liam, watching from the doorway, covered his face with his hands. Tears streamed through his fingers. He knew those stains weren't just grime. His heart fractured, imagining the worst. From there, the team moved to the kitchen and the attached deli. Every utensil was examined, from knives to cutting boards. But the main focus was the large, industrial meat mincer in the corner. The machine looked clean, as if it had just been washed. But Dave's experience told him this was exactly where the secret was hidden. The forensic team began dismantling the machine, piece by piece. They took samples from deep within the crevices, places a normal cleaning would miss. A special testing agent was dropped onto the samples, causing a chemical reaction that confirmed the team's suspicions. The results were immediately recorded and secured. In the backyard, officers checked the feed bins for the chooks. They took samples from the feed, sealing them in evidence bags. The neighbors watching grew quiet, horrified. They whispered to each other, some covering their mouths. The usually cheerful town felt heavy, suffocating. The only sounds were the clicks of the forensic cameras and the quiet footsteps of the officers. Everyone felt that something dark was being unearthed. As the afternoon wore on, the search moved to the small shed beside the house. It was full of tools and bags of feed. In the corner, another faint stain was found and tested. While the initial results were inconclusive, the team took samples anyway. Dave stood back, observing every step. His face grew more serious. He knew the more they found, the stronger the case against Gary became. He didn't say much, only giving quiet, firm instructions to his team. Liam sat on a wooden chair on the porch, his head in his hands. A few neighbors tried to comfort him, but he was beyond words. His mind was in turmoil. He prayed his wife was still alive. But the evidence piling up pointed to the opposite. He took Noah back into his arms. The boy had fallen asleep, oblivious to the fact that his home was the center of a tragedy. Liam kissed his son's head, whispering a prayer only he could hear. As night approached, the search was called off. All the samples were collected, labeled, and rushed to the central lab in Melbourne. Dave told his team that the initial findings were strong enough to proceed, but he stressed that they must remain professional and wait for the official lab reports. His face was stern, his voice steady. He knew their work wasn't finished, but he could feel the truth, cold and hard, within their grasp. Gary, still at the station, was informed about the search. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. He tried to deny everything, insisting the stains were from animal processing. But he didn't know that every word was just digging him into a deeper hole. Dave listened without saying much. He knew the time was almost here. The evidence gathered that day would be the key to breaking Gary's silence. Night fell slowly. The town was quiet again, the only sound the chirping of insects. Liam sat in the living room with Noah asleep in his arms. The dim light illuminated his grim face. He knew the journey was still long. But he also knew the police wouldn't stop. He closed his eyes, praying that Sarah would get justice. Outside, the stars were scattered across the dark sky, silent witnesses to a mystery that was not yet fully revealed. The next day, the atmosphere at the Healesville station was thick with anticipation. The forensic team that had taken the samples from Gary's house began to send their initial reports. Detective Sergeant Nguyen walked quickly into the lab. The experts were waiting, their faces serious. They showed him what they had found, a long, dark strand of hair, caught deep within the mechanism of the meat mincer. Beside it, in a separate evidence bag, were tiny fragments of pale, fleshy matter, suspected human tissue. Dave's heart hammered. He knew they were closer than ever to the grim truth. The report was immediately taken to a special briefing. DCI Kate Wilson was there, sitting at the head of the table, her face grim. The entire investigative team gathered. Dave laid out the findings, one by one. He explained how the hair could not have come from livestock. How the tissue fragments were found in a place they should never be. Every word added to the heavy silence in the room. Everyone knew this case was no longer a suspicion, it was a horrific, tangible reality. Meanwhile, at his home, Liam had not been told the full details. The police were waiting for the final confirmation, not wanting to cause any more trauma than necessary. Liam just tried to get through the day. He made breakfast for Noah, though he had no appetite himself. Noah asked for his mum again, this time with a little frown. Liam forced a sad smile and said Mummy was still sleeping. The boy nodded, seemingly accepting it, and went back to his toy cars. Liam watched him, tears welling in his eyes. He prayed that Noah would one day understand, even though the truth was so brutal. At the station, Gary was brought in for another interrogation. He sat in the chair, his face rigid. Dave placed the evidence bag containing the strand of hair on the table. Gary's eyes glanced at it, then quickly looked away. "Do you know where this hair came in from, Gary?" Dave asked. Gary's voice was heavy. He claimed it must have been from an animal, caught up when he was processing meat. But his voice wavered. Dave didn't press. He knew the best strategy was to present the evidence, piece by piece, until Gary had no escape. Liam, waiting outside the room, felt his chest tighten again. He wanted to burst in, to scream at his father. But he was told to wait. He just sat, his head bowed, holding back a storm of emotion. In his heart, he was already sure his father was involved. But he still needed to hear the confession. He needed the truth, even if it would destroy him. He went home that night with heavy steps. Noah hugged him tightly, which gave him the small amount of strength he needed to keep going. The next morning, the initial lab results came back. The experts confirmed the hair was human, not animal. The tissue fragments also showed human characteristics. While they were still waiting on the final DNA confirmation, this was enough to solidify the case. Dave felt a grim sense of relief, mixed with horror. He knew the case was about to enter its final, decisive stage. All the scientific evidence was slowly pointing to one, undeniable, terrible truth. In the town, the rumors were flying faster than ever. People started to avoid Gary's house entirely. They were afraid, and they were angry. Some of the local women cried when they spoke of Sarah. They couldn't believe a gentle young mother could meet such an end. The church was filled with prayers. Children were forbidden from playing anywhere near the house. The town's warmth had been replaced by a grim pallor. The sense of community remained, but it was now shrouded in fear and grief. Gary was feeling the pressure. He sat in his holding cell, his face blank. His eyes were red, his hands shook. He knew the walls of his lies were crumbling. Every piece of evidence was a new bar in his cage. But he remained silent. He believed that if he didn't confess, there was still a chance. He didn't realize that scientific proof is far stronger than words. Dave watched him through the one-way glass, his gaze cold. He knew the time was coming. That night, Dave sat at his desk, writing a long, detailed report. The desk lamp lit his tired face. He wrote down every single detail, meticulously. He knew this report would be the key to the legal process. His heart was heavy, but his determination was unshaken. He felt responsible not just to the law, but to Liam and Noah. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved justice for Sarah. Dave closed his notebook, took a long breath, and prayed that the next day would bring the final, clear answer. The following day, the tension at the Healesville police station was palpable, even greater than the days before. The central lab had finally sent the official, finalized DNA results. Detective Sergeant Nguyen was called to receive the document. He walked into the office, his heart pounding. A lab technician handed him a thick, sealed manila envelope. Dave opened it slowly, reading page after page. His expression grew more serious. The DNA test results were conclusive. The hair and the tissue fragments found deep inside the meat mincer were a perfect match to the DNA sample taken from Sarah's hairbrush. There was no more doubt. All the scientific evidence was clear. Dave immediately took the report to the briefing room. DCI Wilson was already waiting, along with other senior officers. With a calm but firm voice, Dave presented the results. He explained that not only the hair, but the tissue fragments, definitively belonged to Sarah Turner. The room was silent. Everyone present understood that their worst fears had become a reality. Detective Sergeant Dave Nguyen walked back into the interview room, the official report in his hand. Gary Murdoch looked up, his eyes hollow. The lab results are back, Gary. Dave placed the report on the table, turning it to face him. It's Sarah. The DNA is a 100% match. The hair, the tissue fragments. From the mincer. It's your daughter-in-law. Gary stared at the paper. The words swam. His face, already sallow, turned a sickly, grey-white. All his stories, the animal blood, the she just left evaporated. There was nowhere left to hide. His hands, resting on his knees, began to shake uncontrollably. A low, strangled sound, half-groan, half-sob, tore from his throat. The hard, defiant shell he'd maintained for days finally cracked, then shattered. Gary Murdoch lunged forward, burying his face in his hands. His broad shoulders heaved with dry, gut-wrenching sobs that ripped through the silence of the room. I didn't mean to, he choked out, the words muffled. It was an accident. I swear to God, it was an accident. The details of the crime are revealed. Dave kept his voice steady, professional, despite the cold knot tightening in his own stomach. Tell us, Gary. Tell us exactly what happened. The confession spilled out, a torrent of panic, stupidity, and horrific consequence. It started, just as he'd said, with the argument over money. She wanted to send cash to her mum in Geelong. I told her we didn't have it. The deli's been slow. But she wouldn't let it go. She kept at me. Screaming. Called me a useless old bastard. Said Liam would kick me out, turf me out when he got back. I just snapped. I just wanted her to shut up. I shoved her. Just pushed her, to get her away from me. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. She fell. Went backwards. Tripped. She hit her head. Right on the corner of the brick fireplace. It made this awful sound. A crack. There was blood. So much blood. And she wasn't moving. Her eyes were open. She wasn't breathing. Why didn't you call 000, Gary? Dave asked, his voice low. I panicked, he yelled, his voice cracking. I panicked. I saw the blood, I saw her. I knew I'd be done for. I knew Liam. He'd hate me. My life was over. I just had to. I had to fix it. Dave fought to keep his expression neutral. What did you do next? I waited. Till Noah. Till the boy was fast asleep. I took her. Out to the shed. To the deli. He was weeping openly now, a pathetic, broken man. I saw the mincer. I I thought. If she was just gone, maybe it would be okay. The officers in the room listened, stunned, as Gary Murdoch detailed the unthinkable. How he had used the tools of his trade to dismember his daughter-in-law. How he had fed the remains through the industrial-grade machine. I scrubbed the laundry floor, he wept. I hosed out the shed. I bleached everything. I thought I'd got it all. What did you do with the rest of it, Gary? Some of it. I mixed it with the chook feed. His voice broke. The rest. I put it in the heavy-duty garbage bags. Put em in the wheelie bin. The garbage truck. It came the next morning. The town in shock. The news hit Healesville like a physical blow. As the details were released, a wave of sickness and revulsion rolled through the tight-knit community. It was on every news channel in Melbourne. The Healesville Horror. This wasn't some stranger. This was Gary Murdoch. The bloke who sold snags at the local market. The granddad they'd seen with his grandson. The weatherboard house on the edge of town became a morbid landmark. Police tape cordoned off the entire property. TV news vans lined the street. A shrine of flowers, soggy teddy bears, and rain-soaked cards began to grow against the gate. Rest in peace, Sarah, one read. We are so sorry, said another. The town was shattered. The local pub was quiet, the regulars just staring at the news on the TV, shaking their heads. They couldn't get their heads around the sheer brutality of it. Liam was kept in a safe place, shielded from the media storm. When Dave and a police psychologist had to sit him down and tell him the whole, terrible truth, he had completely broken. His world hadn't just ended, it had been hideously desecrated. He had lost his wife and his father in a single, unimaginable act. His only anchor was his son, Noah, who was too young to understand why his mummy was sleeping, and why he would never see his granddad again. The trial and sentence. The legal process was swift. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, the CCTV footage that proved Sarah had never left, and his own detailed confession, Gary Murdoch's trial was a formality. The media coverage was intense. The courtroom in Melbourne was packed every day, a morbid public fascination with the Healesville butcher. Gary sat in the dock, a hollow shell of a man. He pleaded guilty to murder. During sentencing, the judge described the crime as monstrous and an almost incomprehensible betrayal of familial trust. He spoke of the unimaginable desecration of the victim's body. Gary Murdoch was sentenced to life in prison, with a non-parole period of 25 years. For Liam, there was no victory. No closure. Just the long, bleak road ahead, raising his son alone, haunted by what had happened inside that simple weatherboard house.